For centuries, the world has looked upon Africa as a thief looks upon treasure. It is there to be plundered. Our forefathers were stolen in millions during the slave trade, and our minerals have fed the industries of the West. Our traditional cultures were suppressed, and their artifacts stolen to fill the museums of Europe and America. Our land was occupied by strangers, and our people confined to reserves. Kenya, now an independent African nation, was once meant to become something quite different. At the beginning of this century, the colonial tradition that had transformed North America, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa into European states was supposed to play itself out once more, this time in East Africa. Kenya, in other words, was meant to become a white man's country. Harry Thuku, one of Kenya's first political leaders, died of cancer in 1970. He belonged to a generation whose life spans the entire colonial period in East Africa, from the end of the 19th century to the decade of independence in the 1960s. It is a generation which remembers the first white men to settle in Kenya, the first confrontations with colonial rule, and the long struggle for freedom which followed. A few years before this generation was born, the imperial powers of Europe had already determined its destiny. In the 1880s, Britain, Germany, France, and others divided Africa into spheres of European influence and set about establishing control over peoples and territories they hardly knew existed. In 1895, Britain declared a protectorate over East Africa. At about the same time, the generation which mourned Harry Thuku was born. Their lives are the history of colonialism in Africa.
Arungu acio mokire Kĩambĩrĩria na moimaga na mambathai mokaga marĩ agũri marĩ endia a biashara makendia mirenge.
The white men first came from the coast as buyers and dealers. They sold blankets, bracelets, beads and calico sheets, and they bought elephant tusks in return. But they were not fighting. They were accompanied by armed guards, but fought only if provoked. Their main purpose, really, was trade.
maguraga mendaga into isho.
In 1890, the Imperial British East Africa Company, a private trading company, sent its first expedition through Kenya, led by Captain Frederick Lugard. The treaties and trading centers which Lugard established were the opening gambit in the process of colonization. 10th October, 1890. Wayaki Wahinga, local chief of Wakikuyu, having made blood brotherhood with Captain Lugard, understands by these formalities that he is the sworn friend and ally of the British, that he will supply them with food, that they are free to settle in his land and will never be molested. The British, on their part, will do him no harm. When we first saw white people, they looked to us like premature children. It was taboo to see such things, and we had to undergo a cleansing ceremony. A ram was slaughtered, and its intestines spread on both sides of a river. We had to pass over the intestines to prevent taboo. Lugard went on to Uganda, to the west. The situation behind him deteriorated. In London, the Imperial British East Africa Company found itself in a financial crisis and directed its agents in the field to become self-sufficient. The deliberate and wide-scale confiscation of crops and animals began without regard for ownership or human life. By the time Lugard returned to Kenya, 2 years later, blood brotherhood had been forgotten. August 1892. Our British policy of bringing peace and prosperity to Africa instead of war seems falling to pieces. The company fighting in Kikuyu, and now among the peaceful and friendly Wakamba. Perkis, firing on and killing the Maasai, and Captain Nelson has hammered the peaceful and harmless Wataita, and killed many and hung some on trees. Such is our vaunted peace for Africa. From the letters of Sir Gerald Portal, 3rd February 1893. By refusing to pay for things, by raiding, looting, swashbuckling and shooting natives, the Imperial British East Africa Company has turned the whole country against the white man. Shortly afterwards, Chief Wayaki was captured in a struggle with some company men. The first in a long line of political prisoners, Wayaki died mysteriously on his way to exile.
Reu, thutha magĩikara magĩkaga ũguo
When the traders had been in the country for a few years, their government arrived and began to impose its rule on us. Forts were set up around the countryside, at Dagoretti, Kiambu, Nyeri, and so on. Soldiers were stationed in these forts and were used to control the people. From the private correspondence of Sir Charles Elliot, Commissioner of British East Africa. No doubt on platforms and in reports, we declare we have no intention of depriving natives of their lands. But your lordship has opened this protectorate to white immigration and colonization. And I think it is well that, in confidential correspondence at least, we should face the undoubted issue. That is, that white mates black in a very few moves. There can be no doubt that the Maasai and many other tribes must go under. From the Diaries of Francis Hall, February 1899. We proceeded to march quietly through the country, sending columns out to burn the villages and collect goats. We destroyed a tremendous number of villages, and after 14 days, we emerged on the plains to the eastward, having gone straight from one end to the other of the disaffected districts. We captured some 10,000 goats and a few cattle. And this on top of the previous expedition must have been a pretty severe blow to them. From the Diaries of Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen, King's African Rifles. 8th September 1902. I have performed a most unpleasant duty today. I made a night march to the village where the white settler had been so brutally murdered the day before yesterday. I gave orders that every living thing, except children, should be killed without mercy. Every soul was either shot or bayoneted. We burned all the huts and razed the banana plantations to the ground. May 1905, Sotique. 92 killed, 2,000 cattle, 3,000 sheep and goats captured, 14,000 rounds rifle ammunition used, and 2 Maxim guns. September 1905, Kisii. 100 killed, 3,000 cattle captured. January 1906, Nandi. 1,100 killed, 16,000 cattle, 36,000 sheep and goats captured. January 1908, Kisii again. 200 killed, 7,000 sheep, 5,000 goats. It looks like a butchery, Winston Churchill said when he heard of the Kisii massacre. And if the House of Commons gets hold of it, all our plans in the East Africa Protectorate will be under a cloud. Surely it cannot be necessary to go on killing these defenseless people on such an enormous scale. For the people of Kenya, the price of the Pax Britannica was high. The slaughter of thousands, the forced resettlement of whole tribes outside their traditional areas, the destruction of tens of thousands of homesteads and villages, and the confiscation of hundreds of thousands of cattle, sheep, and goats.
Otiokirwo na wega tuga atĩrĩ rĩu mbara ya mũcinga na itimũ na ngoi nĩ atĩa.
The government did not come peacefully, but what was a spear to a gun? There was fighting, and people were killed. But Europeans won because they had guns. Had it been a matter of spears and swords, things would have been different. In the first 10 years of British involvement in Kenya, more than a third of the colony's budget went into military operations. By 1915, every major tribe had faced at least one so-called punitive expedition. This was the foundation on which 70 years of colonial rule were based. The land of the Kamba and the Boran, of the Luo, the Digo, the Luya, and the Taita. The land of the Maasai, the Meru, the Kikuyu, and the Tugen. Of the Kisii, the Somali, the Turkana, and the Teso. The land of the Embu and the Samburu. Of the Nandi and the Kipsigis. Of the Giriama and the Marakwet. The land of all the peoples of Kenya. I have great hopes that the punishment of the Sutik will bring the Kisii to reason, remarked Commissioner Stewart in 1905. It is most important to open up this part of the protectorate, which is well adapted to European settlement. From a report by Sir Harry Johnston, 1901. Here we have a territory, now that the railway is built, admirably suited for a white man's country. And I can say this with no thought of injustice to any native race. For the country in question is either utterly uninhabited for miles and miles, or at most, its inhabitants are wandering hunters. This will be one source of profit to the United Kingdom. 1906, 1 million acres had been given to settlers. A decade later, 1,000 European farmers had claimed more than 5 million acres of fertile countryside, the White Highlands. For the next 50 years, this rich and abundant part of the country ceased to exist for Africans, except as workers on white farms.
Daddy got fed up with hunting in England and thought he'd like a change, and heard about this country and came out. My grandfather met an old man who said, "Oh, my son's already in East Africa, I'll give you a letter of introduction." When we arrived at Mombasa, there were only 6 European families. Mombasa Club, of course, was going, and one knew everybody down there. And they used to play badminton and cricket and things like that. And it was lovely. It was great fun. And then we came up to Nairobi, complete with dogs, and Major Gailey met us and took us to the Norfolk Hotel.
In 1901, the Uganda Railway was completed. It had been built in 6 years with the help of thousands of Indian laborers, many of whom stayed on afterwards. The line ran for nearly 600 miles, from the port of Mombasa on the Indian Ocean in the east, across the southern part of Kenya to Lake Victoria in the west. Like other railways of the 19th century, it was meant to open up the continent. In fact, it was an economic disaster. The commissioner at the time, Sir Charles Elliot, wrote, "It is a curious confession, but I do not know why the Uganda Railway was built." To help make it pay, he began to encourage South Africans and Englishmen to come to Kenya as settlers.
Well, we got up to Nairobi, or we got up to somewhere, and the engine stopped. So we looked. What's he stopped for? We're at Nairobi. At Nairobi. So we looked around, no Nairobi. Anyhow, there was a little bit of a platform, and so we got out. Well, we went along, and we found Tommy Wood's Hotel, one of 7 tin shacks in a street called Victoria Street.
At Nairobi, Francis Hall wrote, a tin pot mushroom township, they have no less than 5 different law courts. All the magistrates live at their desks, slinging ink, and the place is the most lawless and dangerous spot in Africa. Every night, the police bombard indiscriminately with ball cartridge. And unless one is within stone walls, life is not worth 12 hours' purchase. Now the capital of Kenya, Nairobi was founded in the 1890s as a railway depot on the site of an old safari camp. It was a settler's town from the beginning, filled with people who felt they were on the frontiers of civilization.
Government Road was just one straight street with a line of trees up the middle of it and shops on each side. There were only two. There was a shop called Emma de Souza and a shop called Nazareth, both owned by Guyanese, where Mother went and she bought 3 tin plates and 3 tin mugs to start us with. We had a donkey cart, but we couldn't use the donkey because he wouldn't go, so we went in the donkey cart, Mother and I, with 2 boys in the shafts and 2 boys pushing behind. That's how we used to go to Nairobi and go to the races.
In its early years, Nairobi was the meeting place of Kenya's European colony, a motley collection of people eagerly searching for big game, cheap land, and a distant but not forgotten way of life.
Thank you very much, Master. We came over one evening bird shooting, and Mother looked at the land and said, if we're going to stay in this country, I should like this piece of land. Right away down to Nairobi, it was all open grassland. And this had been a bit of a native shamba, and we got 20 acres to begin with, and from there we built our house, starting by putting the floor, and then we used to come up in the evenings to dance on the floor, and then they put the sides up. And we moved into the house on the 15th of August, 1906.
1906?
Yes.
Were there any other houses round here then?
Very, very few.
Mm.
And we got a pack of hounds at once. There were hounds here when we came, and we had 6 couple.
First thing the British do?
Yes.
Yes. Jolly good. And what did they hunt?
Jackal and Dyker.
Jackal and Dyker.
And all this country was
Yes.
open country. You could
Yes.
go anywhere you liked.
And how long did this pack keep going?
Oh, well, we kept them until 1925.
And they were called the
Masara hounds.
Messiah Hounds, of course they were, yes. No, well, it's a long time since then.
It is a long time.
What sort of clothes did they wear in those days?
The same, hunting pink.
Hunting pink.
Yes. Just as you're dressed now.
Yes,
But we had black collars
yes,
and our own hand buttons.
yes.
And they were all mounted on white horses.
Were they really?
Yes.
Oh, lovely. Gosh, we couldn't manage that nowadays. Did they always drink as much as this in the old days too?
Much more.
Much more. Oh, well. What sort of fields did you have in those days?
Oh, quite big, 30, 40 people.
Did you really?
Yes.
Yes. And those would be mostly farmers then, would they?
Oh, and people from Nairobi and KAR
Yes.
and lots of government officials.
Yes,
They all had horses, you see.
yes.
There were no
Everyone...
motor cars in the early days.
No, of course not. No.
But our life was very much like an English country life in home. I mean, there was very little difference. Very little difference. We had our dogs and our horses and our friends, and we entertained, we went about. The Africans were very friendly and willing to learn, and they worked for one. They'd never worked, of course, before, but they soon learned. We took it for granted that everything was all right.
To the early settlers, Kenya held the promise of feudal England with a better climate. The country never developed a white working class, and the success of the European dream depended, from the beginning, upon African labor. It is essentially an overseer's country, wrote Lord Cranworth in 1912. Once the oxen are broken, and the native taught, continuous manual labor in the sun is no longer necessary. As the land was taken and crowded native reserves set up, and as hut and poll taxes were imposed by the European government, more and more Africans were driven into the colonial economy at the lowest and most menial levels. What emerged before long was a society based, like everything else in the colonial world, on a racial hierarchy. The European at the top, the Indian in the middle, and the African at the bottom. And it persisted almost unchanged for 60 years. Evidence given to the Native Labour Commission, 1912. Supposing a native refuses to turn out to work after having been advised to do so, Mr. Boys states that, if he were district commissioner, he would order him to receive 25 lashes for insulting the government and for being insolent. Mr. Boys takes the attitude that he knows better than they do what is for their benefit. One European is in the habit of harnessing his natives to a plough, and when remonstrated with, excuses himself on the ground that it is only a light cultivator.
The thing that bound, I think, people together in those days, and I can't emphasize it too vividly for you, was this extraordinary sense we all had that we were creating something. The sense of making a country, placing it under British traditions and ideas, developing it, seeing the roads grow, the railways spread, and gradually the land tamed. That was a tremendous bringer together of the Europeans, and it gave them what nowadays we call a sense of mission.
In 1909, Theodore Roosevelt came to Kenya on a hunting safari. I believe this country has a great agricultural and industrial future, Roosevelt told the settlers. And meanwhile, it occupies a unique position as the most attractive playground in the world. The frontier is no place for weak and shiftless people, Roosevelt wrote. But the same kind of man who did well when he went to the far west, to the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains 30 years ago, can do well here. The prime need is to build up a large, healthy population of true white settlers, white homemakers who shall take the land as an inheritance for their children's children. Sooner or later, it must lead to a clash between black and white, Colonel Meinertzhagen had written in 1902. I cannot see millions of educated Africans, as there will be in 100 years' time, submitting tamely to white domination. After all, it is an African country, and they will demand domination. Then blood will be spilled, and I have little doubt about the eventual outcome. In August 1914, a war began in Europe. Within a few weeks, it was raging in East Africa as well. Kenya was a British colony. Tanganyika, its neighbor to the south, was German. The battles went on for 4 years in the only major theater of war outside Europe. In its conduct, the East Africa Campaign was simply another dimension of the colonial system. It rested primarily on African heads and shoulders. We were told to join the army because the Germans were invading our country, and if they succeeded, we would suffer. Many of us were arrested and tied together by ropes. We were taken away and loaded into lorries. It is sad to read, wrote a British medical officer, of how great a boon we bestowed by stopping intertribal war. Since then, our own war has destroyed more life than a generation of intertribal wars. From Kenya alone, the British recruited 160,000 porters, mostly by force. Their casualties were enormous. 42,000 porters died of disease and starvation. Fewer than 400 were actually killed in battle. We had been led to believe that we were fighting for the defense of our country against foreign invaders. And yet, after the war, we were given medals and a gratuity of a few shillings and nothing else. This meant absolutely nothing to us. But the Europeans, with whom we'd fought side by side, were given our land here. They held a big lottery, bringing soil from all over the country and placing it in envelopes. Then each would-be settler drew an envelope from a kerosene drum, and if it said Molo or Nanyuki or Nakuru, he would go and settle there, wherever the soil came from.
Well, people felt they were going to create another dominion, like New Zealand. I remember coming out on the boat, the excitement of people. They felt they were making a new country, and that country would be part of the empire. Then they had a tremendous sense of mission, so fashioned today, but they felt that they had an imperial mission that was bringing something to Kenya, the British way of life.
Na azungu aratwara no mundu akahewe ikachiga nona o kulia kwale gwakwa ngitunyu na twakiruwaga nake ngitunyu ni akinengerwo.
My bitterest memory of the war is being given registration certificates while Europeans were given our land. A former army colleague, a European, got the best part of my land, and I was forced to carry a registration card. The pain of that treatment still lingers in my stomach. The bitterness still lasts, and it is the worst kind of bitterness. Then there was our pay, 4 shillings a month. 4 shillings a month for 30 good days. And some maize flour to eat when you've spent the day carrying a heavy load on your head. Those were very bitter times. And we were deceived that we were fighting for our land. But where is that land, even today? These are the reasons that we formed our political party, because of these injustices and exploitations. It was a most bitter thing to be moved from your home, like this one here, told to get out of the way while your house was destroyed by a tractor.
white man I met was a missionary who formed a mission here about two miles from my home, and his name was called Mr. W.P. Knapp. He was an American mission. That is my first time I met a European before I went to school. I went to the mission. It was an American mission here, about 2 miles from my home here, where we are. So I went to school there, and I acquired the knowledge from that school. My grandfather was called Gazirimu, who had very, very large land here. And my father, his name was called Kairianja.
The settlers soon found their position challenged by a new generation, baptized as Christians, conversant in the English language, and ready to reclaim the dignity and freedom taken from their fathers by the Maxim gun. In Harithuku, the new generation found a spokesman.
My feeling came in 1915 when we saw many Europeans coming and taking African farms without asking any question or paying any compensation. I was working in government offices afterwards. After 1914 war, I was working in Treasury. So everybody, even settlers here, around here, was known to me very well. They know me very well. We wanted to get our land back first. And if they give us our land back, they will not stay here because they would have nothing to do.
The
first political party was for the whole of the African population, and it was called the East African Association. It was led by Harithuku. Now, Thuku obtained the address of the Colonial Office in England and sent a telegram there, setting forth our grievances. When the government here learnt of this, they were very agitated. The settlers said they would not compromise, and they demanded that Thuku be arrested.
I was arrested on 14th March 1922. I was taken to police line, Government Road, and after that the Africans start assembling there, asking for my release.
No Africans in Nairobi were working those 2 days. We had pickets out to make sure people did not break the strike. Mary Muthoni Nyanjiru leapt to her feet, pulled her dress right up over her shoulders and shouted to the men, "You take my dress and give me your trousers. You men are cowards. What are you waiting for? Our leader is in there. Let's get him." Mary and the others pushed on until the bayonets of the rifles were pricking at their throats. And then the firing started. Mary was one of the first to die. On the other side of the lines, the European settlers sitting drinking on the veranda of the Norfolk Hotel joined in the shooting, and it is said they were responsible for most of the deaths over there. The East African Standard, 18th March 1922. The government can rest assured that it has the unquestioning support of the entire European population in any steps it may take to maintain law and order, and that every white man and every white woman are at the government's call to this end. The position is now considered to be completely under control, and no further outbreak is anticipated.
Do you know who Harry Thuku was?
He was the first politician we had in Kenya.
He was a great man and he was a big farmer. And he fought for Uhuru, freedom.
He was a great man. He was a great leader, a hero.
Harry Thuku?
Yes.
I think he was a freedom fighter.
Did you know that he just died the other day?
Yeah, I know that he died on Monday. On Sunday.
Na tondo ni kwenda kwa kwete oime gokothi nitwagucokeria ngatho na riu kuona ati Ngai mwene hinya wothe nietire mũrata ũyũ witũ Mr. Harry Thuku iria ũkũrĩte na twahoya ũguo nĩ ũndũ wa Jesu Kristo mwathani witũ.
For 30 years after Harry Thuku's arrest, the struggle continued. New parties and new leaders emerged, but their petitions and delegations to Britain, their protests and strikes in Kenya did not produce results. By 1952, the only alternative was to take up arms. The world called it Mau Mau, but it was nothing more nor less than a war of national liberation. The colonizers were forced to admit that Kenya was not, after all, a white man's country. Within a few years, Jomo Kenyatta, a man of Harry Thuku's generation, came to power at the head of Kenya's first African government.